This is the Wizard of New Zealand, and this is part 2 of The Blob and I. Where did the blob come from? The blob, although a global phenomenon, is very recent emergent. To understand its essential structure and function, and prepare yourself to survive its attacks and take evasive action, we should look at the history of explanations of the overall meaning of life, or cosmology, that are relevant. The last coherent cosmology in the West was created by Sir Thomas Aquinas and the Christian scholastics before the mercantile industrial society replaced the previous agricultural civilization in Europe. His cosmology depended on control and feedback, and even allowed for qualitative upgrading through the awaited second coming. All levels in the hierarchy of being were controlled through the governor's will to love, backed up by the will to power. Active participation of all levels in the process provided the feedback. The governor in this cosmology was an ingenious synthesis of Aristotle's power-based rational prime mover, hierarchical Neoplatonic aesthetic being, and the love-based moral Christian trinity of transcendental governor, human exemplar, and all-pervading immanent spiritual energy. The scientific revolution. The new, less inclusive, and much less coherent metaphysics assumed by the materialistic technician scientists of the 17th century and updated in the 18th century Enlightenment was of a heartless, machine-making, monotheistic God and his soulless mechanism they called nature. This was not an integrated cosmology, and its designers deliberately excluded what they dismissed as irrelevant and useless metaphysics from their consideration. Since they believed the material and biological universe was a soulless mechanism, they could not imagine there'd be any participation or feedback from the lower levels. The cosmos was no longer other than the sum of its parts. The technician scientists were motivated to understand the various laws of nature so they could achieve improved control over them. The measure of what represented improvements was based on better physical functioning of the body, machine, and the more efficient manufacturing and distribution of commodities, which market forces would deliver. Increasingly, religion was being explained as outdated superstition, building up the historical inevitability of material progress. Survival of the fittest, fighting, fornicating, fertility machines. In the 19th century, inspired by the utilitarian mechanistic metaphor, anti-theistical, materialistic scientists found a new retrospective explanation for all life, including mankind, as survival of the fittest organisms, selected by chance through purely mechanistic causation. This evolutionary theory was an old one, but new data and geological advances made the case convincing. Social Darwinists extrapolated from this new biological explanation the belief that the will to power was the only true dynamic that drove political and economic development. This theory fell upon fertile ground. In rapidly industrializing Europe, psychological forces were building up for a fight. Catastrophic violence followed. Wars were fought between secular states armed with even more deadly weapons, and traditional peace treaties based on compromise were replaced by total victory or total defeat. Survival of the fittest fighting machine. Globalization and bureaucratization. Human cultures either expand or contract. Local deities either become world religions or decline and disappear. Since the early Iron Age, the general trend has been for the universalizing market forces of urban manufacturers to progressively demolish rural fertility technicians and believers in salvation from sin. They were transformed into manufacturing technicians and the spellbound worshippers of commodities. Local and even national economies are either absorbed into the global economy or go out of business. The scientific technological revolution, the harnessing of steam and the burning of fossil fuels made Britain, then Europe, and then America industrial giants. Their expansionist colonial policies destroyed rival cultures and established market economies throughout most of the world. Now other superpowers are starting to rise. The United States seizes a unique opportunity but drifts towards the rocks. The dollar of the Reserve Bank of America was established in 1944 as the new world reserve currency after Europe was bankrupted by 2 world wars, and has been maintaining its dominance by force of arms ever since. In 1971, the American government legally detached their currency from its material base in gold. The anchor having been cut loose, the entire global economy began to drift towards the rocks. There was now no limit to the manipulation of the commodity value of paper currency by banks, governments and currency speculators. The sovereignty of nation-states was being dissolved by the legally unrestrained market forces of laissez-faire economics and the legalization of globalized multinational corporations as persons in law. The monetarized managerialism of the Blob became the new world order. Voluntaristic love replaced by compulsory legislation. This was accompanied by increasing secularization through welfare state legislation, including compulsory education aimed at job creation. Although based on the will to love, which is inherited from a declining and despised religious welfare institutions, providing these welfare services needed a power structure to be effective. The welfare states were like communism, organised by highly centralised bureaucracies, administered by the secular central governments, and were therefore not love-based and voluntary, but power-based and compulsory. They were financed by a high level of compulsory taxation, which considerably increased the numbers and power of the administrative bureaucracy of the central state. The monopoly of teacher training, school curricula and certification, healthcare and welfare, and grants to the politically correct artists resulted in a massive, arrogant bureaucracy which frequently overruled voluntary associations with similar aims, producing a sense of powerlessness and despair. Their distrust of the citizenry in common sense matters led to free citizens being treated like domesticated animals. Others saw it as mature adults being transformed into irresponsible children bossed around by the health and safety control freaks of the nanny state. Consequently, deep cultural values were replaced by shallow, fashionable, modern ideas of identity, imposed by secular education and backed up by the mass media of escapist entertainment, with its puppet celebrities or lovies as role models. The blind and irresponsible collective will to power. 100 years ago, the intellectual rationale of the mechanistic cosmology and its supernatural designer, created during the mercantile industrial enlightenment, collapsed and broke into innumerable irreconcilable fragments. Most scientists in the specialised university departments and research laboratories simply ignored this and carried on their sponsored utilitarian work in universities and technical institutes. When the centre cannot hold, disintegration of any coherent worldview leads to schizophrenia and the inevitable emergence of the blood-stained blob. In the absence of any coherent metaphysics, the blob acts as a blind, irresponsible, collective will to power. There is no narrative other than the ancient belief that the reductionist atomists of ancient Miletus in unending, godless, material, technological progress. This unilinear and meaningless view of history is only interrupted by sudden violent outbreaks provoked by expectations of imminent divine intervention, or in the Jacobin fantasy of a great egalitarian revolution, a secular version of the biblical end of history. Although its form as a whole is resilient, and its outer managerial protective shell is like steel plate, the blob is blind, fearful and paranoid, and as a collective psychosis is easily provoked into irrational rage. The behaviour of the blob is that of a huge, thick-skinned monster driven by psychological, political, ideological and economic forces that it is not even aware of itself. Like all evil entities, it is drawn unconsciously towards goodness, beauty and truth, which is a desperate need to destroy. Its enemy need not be politically virtuous, just good, beautiful and truthful enough to provide a target to aim at. Human rights and identity politics. The ethnocentric and historically determined doctrine of secular egalitarian human rights was largely driven by resentment of a hierarchy as the basic principle of human organisation, which characterised both the American and French revolutions. Unlike the moral egalitarianism of Christianity, from which it was derived, such human rights are not only ripped out of their cultural context that all human beings depend upon, but avoid the vital issue of reciprocal obligations. As a general principle, owing to its origins in secularised, eschatological, Abrahamic religions, the left see the right as evil and aims to eliminate them by coercion, since the rule of law itself is part of the evil old world. The class war becomes the classroom war. Initially, inequalities of income provided the justification of the revolutionary destruction of the old order. However, the standards of living for the peasants and industrial workers in North America and non-communist Europe had greatly improved by the end of the 20th century. Since the Second World War, the Industrial Revolution had rapidly evolved from a preeminently manufacturing society to a consumer society, which requires great numbers of educated intellectuals in the service sectors. To create sufficient anger to overthrow the unjust system and bring about the revolution, resentment in the Nietzschean sense now had to be focused away from inequality. Intellectuals of the left were not only abandoning the traditional base in working-class unions and the collapsing Soviet Union, but were now putting their hopes in the powerful middle-class welfare state bureaucrats, now organised into industrial unions. The authoritarian old Marxists in the West, although still embedded in large numbers in the humanities schools and the universities, were exchanging Marxist humanism for Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony to become neo-Marxists. In the consumer boom of the 1960s, there had been a youth rebellion, fomented and augmented by the rapidly growing electronic mass media conglomerates, which were now transmitting not only more sensually arousing popular music, but flooding the world with sexually explicit images and sensational portrayals of violence, previously banned as disgusting and disturbing. The newly affluent teenagers, with their considerable disposable income, provided the major source of revenue for the purchase of associated commodities and services. The older generation, with the traditional less materialistic beliefs and more polite practices, were increasingly marginalised. Inspired by Gramsci, the neo-Marxists transferred their hope for finding foot soldiers for the revolution away from the declining number of workers in the factories to the increasing number of overeducated middle-class students in the classrooms, especially the newly expanded universities. The main target was the newly established departments of sociology. The revolution was now to be run by the educational institutions of the ruling establishment, top-down, not bottom-up. Instead of easily measured income differences, the neo-Marxist materialists were now focused on easily measured biological differences. So-called identity politics was aimed at breaking up any cultural cohesion provided by values more meaningful than superficial phenomena like race of origin, skin colour or gender. Teenagers are, of course, more likely to be attracted to an ideology which is superficial and not based on any experience. Once ripped out of their embedding in the hated traditional cultural context and moralised as a collection of unquestionable new egalitarian absolutes, human rights can be imposed by force, even overruling the rule of law based on historical experience. This provided the revolutionary leaders with guidelines for a managerial long march through the institutions. The result was the elimination of all cultural values that could stand in the way of a monopoly of power without any of the responsibility previously provided by the law and by ethical systems such as patriotism or religious ethics. This is meaningless managerialism triumphant. Deconstructionists chew up and swallow culture and then vomit bile. Socialists are reductionists who ascribe ultimate meaning to materialistic social phenomenon, devoutly believe in the coming of a great levelling revolution, and regard cultural values such as Christianity and other ethical spiritual traditions not as a people's main source of meaning, but as dispensable and counter-revolutionary epiphenomena. This ideology has been growing since the Enlightenment and has not only led to total mind control by ruthless dictators, but has also led to mass society, mass education, mass world wars, and the infomercial, mass media, fake news, and the growth of a huge army of salaried business managers, lawyers, consultants, economic jargon mongers, as well as parasitic, unionised public servants living off the massive income tax take. Despite having been brilliantly pilloried earlier by such disillusioned socialist writers as George Orwell in Animal Farm and 1984, the entire range of heterogeneous beliefs and practices other than those encouraged by puritanical, authoritarian socialist ideology become anathema. Free speech is now carefully monitored by the new ministries of truth, established universities, who ban the use of certain words and define non-left-wing language as hate speech. Blasphemy, obscenity, and hate speech directed at the evil right flourish, free from control. But any slightly unorthodox political opinions are quickly labelled right-wing, fascist, racist, sexist, etc., and forcibly excluded from respectable discourse in politically correct educated circles. There are, as usual, 100 adultish Sancho Panzas temporarily sucking up to each deluded Don Quixote who can provide a source of material support. The protective managerial shell. With the backing of the banks, stock exchanges, and the powerful military-industrial complex, including the secret services, the managerial elite is an institutional conglomerate which acts as the major constituent of a protective shell formed around the evil, malevolent entity of the Blob. I must emphasise that it is not material gain that motivates the Blob. It's prepared to foul its own nest and destroy the source of its own wealth. It's the addictive ring of power that, once put on, is almost impossible to remove. In 1968, that pivotal year of youthful uprisings, the coalescence of institutions in the emerging global consumer civilization finally established a legitimizing base in the universities. The Blob could now become an autonomous, irresponsible, super-imperialist monster. Gramsci's cultural hegemony was realised as the Blob. At the same time, very different and little-known but highly relevant events were taking place in the Antipodes, at the newly established School of Sociology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. This will be described later in this essay. End of part 2.